Good morning, and welcome to the virtual worship service for Allen Avenue Unitarian Universalist Church, affectionately called A2U2. My name is Anne Funderburk, and I'm presenting the service today along with three other members of A2U2, Clay Atkinson, Elizabeth Forrest, and Steve Hansen. Special thanks go to Erica Bartlett for video editing the service. Summer lay-led services are a long-standing tradition at A2U2. Today's service is the last of the summer services. Next week, beginning on September 13, most services will be led by our new minister, the Reverend Donna Dolo. This week, 1/3 of our offering will be shared with the Greater Portland Family Promise, which is an affiliate of the National Family Promise program. This is dedicated to addressing the needs of families facing homelessness in the Greater Portland, Maine area through an interfaith network and connections with existing community resources. A2U2 is one of the churches in their network. If you'd like to contribute to the offering, you can go to our website and use the donate button at the top of the page. Choose the option to give to the plate. You can also send a check to the church. And finally, a reminder that we will have our virtual coffee hour beginning at 10:45 this morning. The link for that is on our website, a2u2.org. We hope you'll join us then when we share our joys and concerns and then break into small groups for conversation. It is our custom at A2U2 at the beginning of the service to light a chalice, which is the symbol of our faith. Please say with me in unison the words printed in your program. May the light we now kindle inspire us to use our powers to help and not to hinder, to heal and not to harm, to bless and not to curse, to serve you, Spirit of freedom. Our opening hymn this morning is number 188, Come, Come, Whoever You Are. These are the opening words for the rest of the service. The first principle of Unitarian Universalism states, and I quote, "We covenant to uphold the inherent worth and dignity of every person." In these tumultuous and uncertain times, living this principle may present many of us with serious challenges. I know that I struggle with it on a daily basis. I have asked three of our members to share how they practice this principle by addressing the following questions. How do I practice this principle in my life? Do I ever have trouble with it? If so, what do I do? Our first speaker this morning is Clay Atkinson. Thank you, Clay.
Hi, I'm Clay Atkinson. Thanks a lot, Anne, for asking me to participate in your service. Of course, I said yes. I wouldn't be a UU if I didn't believe in the first principle. Then you asked 3 simple questions, forcing me to think more deeply about this principle. It turned out to be more work than I'd planned on. Then, in one of our church groups, having a topic related to racism, Nancy Cunningham suggested there's a significant difference between getting it and owning it. So I probed her a little bit on that and began to understand certainly the difference. My conclusion is I get it, and in some areas I own it. I was fortunate that my parents appeared to accept people of other races and religions. However, I don't think we ever talked or discussed about LGBT. During the 50s, my parents thought it was abhorrent that people of color were discouraged from living in beautiful downtown Burbank. That's the 50s. That's not that long ago. Since Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, I've worked directly or indirectly on environmental issues for a healthier planet, trying to benefit humanity. I really didn't spend much time with Black Americans until I worked in graduate school with Black business people in the Watts area and assisting them in terms of growing a business or getting a business started. I also worked with Black children in Minneapolis neighborhoods. I spent a lot of years working with street kids, mostly white, and I also belonged to Mentium to learn from and to mentor to women in business. Excuse me, in recent years, I worked on the Occupy movement with it for quite a long time. And yesterday I went down to the city hall to see really what was going on with the whole homeless issue. And of course, they're encamped on the steps of City Hall. In all these cases, I probably learned more from all of them than they ever did for me. In the area of self-awareness, self-respect, I've done a lot of work over the years, and I've made a significant headway. I do feel personally inherent worth, so I've come a long way in that regard. Do I ever have trouble supporting or working on this first principle? Well, the answer is, so I get it, and historically I've worked to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of a cross-section of other people. However, do I really own it? I've seen poverty, but I've never personally experienced it. I've witnessed discrimination, but I've only had a brief brush with it myself. I've helped someone get legal rights to change gender, but I didn't have to go through all the emotional and physical pain. Maybe a better description is I have mostly leased it and not owned it. I believe it's extremely hard to fully own it unless you personally experience it. A very specific example, a recent example, in fact, is I got caught sideways on this specific principle. I was joined in the elevator by a casually well-dressed young Black man. Within seconds, I found myself checking to see if my wallet was still in my back pocket. Would I have done that same thing if it was a white man? So the next question is, what do I do should this happen? Well, in the case of the elevator example, I started with awareness, the realization that I don't always own the principle. More broadly, because of your assigned exercise, I have gone beyond awareness and I have done what I call WITS exercise. And that WITS stands for walk in their shoes. And I've tried to walk in the shoes of being in poverty, of those being in poverty. I've tried to walk in the shoes of a Black man looking for a job, or a woman putting up with sexual harassment. All of those are hard to do. At least the WITS exercise gets you there to some degree. And so I've learned some from that. So in final conclusion, I'm still a work in process. Thank you.
Will you please join me in a moment of meditative silence? Let us hold in our hearts and minds all those who are suffering want, grief, disease, fear, and peril. Our second speaker this morning is Elizabeth Forrest. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Good morning, everyone. Elizabeth Forrest here. So, Anne Funderburk asked me, what do you do to uphold the first principle? First principle? I'm thinking, quick, the U, do, re, mi. 1. Each person is worthwhile. Oh, yeah. Well, that one's pretty obvious, isn't it? Everyone has their own story, their own experiences, their own reasons for who they are. You do, I do, we all do. And every one of these realities is important, right? Seems pretty easy. All we need to do is find ways to meet each person in a place that includes something from both our worlds, and voila! First principle accomplished! Yay! Right? Only problem is the noise already in our individual worlds. Cultural differences, family history, preconceptions, trauma, even our own current physical and mental state. These all inform our impressions of other people and can lead to assumptions that too often prevent us from taking the opportunity that we have every time we interact with another to discover who they really are. When I'm being my very best self, I try very hard to do 5 things to break through that din and discover why that person is worthwhile. Recently, I've been working for the census, and I go door to door, and each time someone opens their door, I have a new opportunity to connect with them. So I smile, I use open body language, and I pull something positive out of the air to help us connect. A pet, or something I like in their yard, or whatever. I make myself approachable. That's number 1. And it's not hard to do in that very limited situation, but it gets more intense if an interaction continues. As I am getting into longer discussions with people, I ask the other person questions to get a view of something a bit deeper about them that helps me to understand their worldview better. And I try to listen actively. I consciously push away my own desire to speak, my own assumptions, and I try not to get bogged down in judgments. I learned a great lesson about this from one of my 6th grade students years ago. I had never really noticed her too much. She seemed to always have friends. She seemed like a nice kid, but she wasn't much of a reader, and she never raised her hand in my library class. And I had tons of kids, so, there wasn't time. Until one day, some high school kids came to do skits about drugs and making choices and ethical and emotional dilemmas. Well, this girl started raising her hand, and she kept on raising her hand, and she kept on coming out with these insights that showed a maturity far beyond her age. I was completely blown away. I got to see where some of her depth lay, and that changed not only my awareness of her, but my awareness of myself and some of the things about my teaching style that I needed to change. So, active, non-judgmental listening is number 2, and letting what you hear change you is number 3. Both of these require lifelong practice, and I'm never wholly successful at either of them, but I keep on practicing anyway. Now, if I'm still having trouble connecting with someone, all those negatives are going on in my brain, I use the old adage, walk a mile in their shoes. Not very original, but there it is. It's sometimes incredibly hard. Again, I'm usually not always completely successful, but I always learn a lot when I try. Here's an example. At a new job, my boss started being really negative with me, almost from my first day of work. For some time, I was angry and confused and hurt, and I just dismissed her. Oh, she's just a mean person. But as I watched and listened over weeks and months, I gradually realized that she was pregnant, she already had a toddler, and she was trying to run a business while making it look like she and her husband were running it together. Now, he was a real nice guy, and clearly she loved him, but he had really severe ADHD, and so she felt she had to be the one to run the show. Lots of pressure. Well, nominally, she hired me to replace her front-end manager, but what she really wanted was the woman who had been in that role before, who had acted as a very subtle second in command that this woman so desperately needed to make this trick look like reality. Well, she was grieving the loss of that companion of several years when I showed up. I certainly couldn't be just like my predecessor, especially once my ADD reared its ugly head. So my boss resented me not only because I was not the person she really wanted, but also because in her world, I embodied all her husband's ADD qualities, all the difficult ones. It took me a while to see this, to understand all this. But once I did, I could forgive her for her behavior toward me, and I could change some of my own behaviors, and I could work for her to my own satisfaction instead of hers, since she was never going to like me. Understanding her view of this world that we shared allowed me to stow my own insecurities and have more compassion for her, and for her family, and for her staff, and for myself. So forgiveness was really the key to this whole situation for me. So, for whatever it's worth, this is my advice for seeing that each person is indeed worthwhile. Make yourself approachable, find connections, listen actively, reserving judgment. Let the surprises from this guide you, and try to understand other people's worlds with compassion and forgiveness, both for them and for you yourself. Working through these steps helps me see others' realities for what they are, different from mine, yet always with commonalities and reflections of my own being in them. We are all worthwhile. And that is how I try to live out the first A2U principle.
Our next hymn is number 34, Though I May Speak with Bravest Pride.
Though I may speak with bravest fire, and have the gift to all its power, and have not love, my words are vain, a sounding brass, and hopeless gain. Though I may give all I possess, and striving so my love profess, but not be given my love within, the prophet soon turns strangely thin. Come, Spirit, come, our hearts control, our spirits long to be made whole. Let inward love guide every deed. By this we worship and are freed.
Our third speaker is Steve Hansen. Thank you, Steve.
Hi, I'm Stephen Hansen. I will be describing my difficulties when implementing the first principle, as well as ways I try to overcome those difficulties. My day job is as a professor of accounting, and I should start by describing my first few years of teaching. There were 3 different and pretty dreadful problems with my beginning teaching. The first is that accounting graduate school in the early 1980s didn't really bother to teach us how to teach. They didn't provide any useful guidance in teaching. I had a 3-hour seminar on how to write a syllabus, and that was it before I went into the classroom. So I had no training on something that takes up 50% of my time for the last 30 years. The second problem was that I was in the final stages of my PhD in economics when I decided to get a PhD in accounting instead. So at that point they were a little loose with the rules, and all I had to do was to take a few seminars in accounting research in order to get a PhD in accounting, which meant that I had actually not to take any of the accounting courses. So I went into teaching having taken none of the courses that the students were required in order to get a CPA. In the beginning of my career, I was keeping about 1 chapter ahead of the students. So as a lot of students believe, the professor may not be a total expert in the material that they're teaching. So at this point, I had 2 strikes against me. I had no training in teaching and no clear comprehension as to what I was supposed to teach. In the first year, I did discover the benefits of sitting through other professors' classes and mooching their notes. And so within a year, I had a pretty good idea about what to teach, but still no clear idea about how to do it. And the third problem with my teaching is very relevant to my reflection. I grew up as a shy, geeky kid in Nebraska, and graduate school didn't really change any of that. In fact, it reinforced the geeky part. At a cocktail party, I was once asked what type of people I was most comfortable with, and after some reflection, I decided that the answer was that I was comfortable with white, introspective, non-sports playing males from Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, and South Dakota. And at that point, probably about 5% of my first class. Everyone else I was uncomfortable with. The more boxes that were not ticked, the more uncomfortable I became. So now we hit my long-term problem with acknowledging the inherent worth and dignity of every person. I have had and still have so many implicit biases that I was giving lower grades to anybody but the white, introspective, non-sports playing males from a few states. I think we honor the inherent worth and dignity of every person by giving them a fair grade, a grade that reflects their true performance. To my credit, I realized this problem fairly early. I'm a statistics nerd, and I ran lots of analyses and figured out that my grades were biased against, among others, women, minorities, international students, and sports jocks. 95 to 98% of the audience. In the beginning of teaching, I thought about making adjustments for this, but I decided that ad hoc means ad hoc, which means arbitrary, and so I didn't do anything. So for 2 semesters, I gave what I would call pretty poorly thought out grades. I couldn't figure out how to fix it. I would offer apologies to the students who took my first 2 years of classes. I mentioned this problem to my one female colleague at the time, and she explained how they conduct auditions in orchestras, and this at least gave me a lot of ways to think about the problem. Turns out that in the 1940s and 1950s, the conductor of the orchestra would hire whoever they liked, usually white males that were their friends. In the 60s and 70s, they came up with a better alternative. They set up a screen across the entire stage so that they couldn't see who was playing, and they had everyone audition behind the screen. In addition, they would make them take off their shoes, since high heels make a sort of a click-click sound when you cross the stage. Once they removed the ability to see who was playing, the composition of orchestras drastically changed. There was a significant increase in the percentage of women and minorities. So my colleague's implicit and later explicit suggestion was to try and create a screen between me and the students, make my grading blind. After some thought, I came up with the first set of changes in my classroom. And I had the students write their name only on the first page of the test, which contains no questions. So the first thing I do when I grade is I flip that page over, and then I shuffle the tests. And this way I have no idea who I'm grading at any particular point. The first time I did this, I got called into the dean's office. It turns out that this was the second year that a large number of women MBA students had shown up at Northwestern, and I had the unusual distinction of being the only professor in the entire school who gave all the women A's. The dean was very concerned that I was biased in favor of women. So once I explained what I was doing, he had a change of heart and he mandated blind grading for all MBA core classes. As I mentioned earlier, I'm a statistics nerd. 11 years after the women started showing up in the MBA program in big numbers, my statistics showed that they had the same average as the men. In the 13th year, there was another great milestone. It turns out that the dumbest person in the class, in fact, one of the dumbest people I've ever met, was a female. And this was a big moment for me. I do one other thing in the classroom which helps quite a bit. If I give credit for answers in class, I walk down the list of the students alphabetically. This prevents me from unconsciously calling on those big extroverts who like to sit in the front row. It also helps the introverts who know what they're going to be called soon, and then they can start to figure out what sort of answer they want to give to the next question. So my answer on how do I acknowledge the inherent worth and dignity of every person is to make sure that they are graded fairly. Now, I want to put a footnote. I'm an academic. I got to put a footnote in on this. I know that fair grading is only part of the problem. Another very significant issue is that a lot of disadvantaged groups do not get sufficient training or sufficient funding in order to show up in the classroom to begin with. So I think these are really big issues, but I try and resolve those by attending protests and going and voting and voting.
Our closing hymn, number 131, Love Will Guide Us. Please join me in saying the words for extinguishing the chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, nor the fire of commitment. These we hold in our hearts until we are together again. Go in peace, go in love, go in community. Blessed be.